In previous videos, we put down new tongue and groove flooring, framed the angled ceiling and walls, leveled the floor and fitted door jambs to our filled-in veranda remodeling project. In this video, we'll be lining the walls and ceiling with fake tongue and groove, trying to get it to match the walls with real tongue and groove the best we can. We're ready to start lining the walls now. We'll be using a medium density fibre board, or MDF for short. It's 9.5 millimeters thick and it has grooves cut in it, so it looks like a tongue and groove. It's not real tongue and groove, but we'll make it look as believable as we can. Now, we can't cut the sheets in here as we've done in other rooms because there just isn't enough space in here. So we use a clipboard to write down the dimensions of each sheet because they need to be cut into the angles and doors and whatever. So we'll start with this corner, and I'm presuming that's about the 1200 mark, which is the width of a sheet. And not even close. It's like 1340, but that doesn't really matter because the sheets do have a groove on their edges and a plastic tongue goes between them, so they line up anyway, so they don't necessarily need to be on timber, but it is good to have them as close as we can get them. So if we just measure this up, away we go. We start by making a sketch of each sheet we are to measure so we can keep track of where each measurement is. When we take these measurements, we always take from a reference point. In this case, it's this corner. That way we don't get a cumulative error. And the other thing is we've made the ceiling 2.45 and the sheets are 2.42. So we need to allow a bit of space at the top and bottom, which will be covered by skirting board and a scotia around the top. The reason we made the flat part of the ceiling slightly higher than the length of the sheet was so that we could use the timber that was already in the ceiling, saving us having to pull it all apart and rebuild it. To get the measurements accurate, we also need to consider how plumb the walls are and doorways and how they line up square to the ceiling. That's where the ceiling is level. There's also that angled bit. Where we use a builder's square on the edge of where the sheet will be and measure X and Y dimensions to get the slope. We're cutting the sheets up in this workshop area here. An advantage of that is we don't have to cut the full sheet very far. Put it on these trestles that's a comfortable height. We then transfer the measurements from our clipboard to our sheet, starting from our reference corner, which takes a bit of time because each measurement must be considered carefully and cross-checked. So once the sheet is cut, you know it's correct. Otherwise, it's a $60 sheet down the gurgler. And then when we're ready to cut, we must make sure that we cut the sheet and not the trestle. Otherwise, it's a $60 trestle down the gurgler. This means having to move the sheet around each time a new cut is made, so we're not cutting into the trestle with that saw. We're cutting to one side of a pencil line by eye, which isn't dead accurate, but is close enough. From the top of the doors and any windows, we need to do plunge cuts because we can't start the saw from the edge of the sheet. We use a jigsaw to get into the very corners where the circular saw can't. Once done, we can then check if the sheet fits.
Oh, we forgot to do the check out there. Damn, okay. Oh, right. I can do that with the little saw.
This cutout can be marked out directly because the sheet is just there. Fiddly cuts we can do with a small cordless saw and clean up the corners with a chisel. Now to see if the sheet will fit. It appears to be a little tight. Nothing a little bit of gentle persuasion won't fix, and we're in.
I have to wear a mask in there because the insulation gets into your lungs. It's nasty.
To attach the sheets to the wall, we use a small bradding gun because brads hold into MDF quite well and they leave a small hole that is easy to fill in later. We then cut another sheet for the second half of this wall. The tricky part here is getting the two sheets to fit together using that plastic tongue so they end up seamless. That second sheet appears to be a little wide and I can't get the saw in there, so rather than have to pull the whole sheet out and realign that tongue again, I'm adjusting it with a chisel. Well, I tried to, but in the end it wouldn't work, so I've had to mark out how much has to come off, remove that sheet, undo that little tongue, trim it with that little cordless saw, and once it's all right, try and fit that tongue back in. And we're away. Eventually. Whoever said this was going to be easy? After a little more persuasion with the chisel, we eventually can brad the sheet in place.
Right, well, best to go from this corner next because that sheet will come to there and the next one will come to there, so we can use probably an offcut to fill in that gap. Right, an issue that we have with this window is this sill's hard up against the framing. And cutting around that, it's quite difficult. It would be easier to cut a piece of the sill out to allow sheeting to slip in behind there. So that's the next thing we need to do. Cool. Right, I've measured this at 10 mil. I'm not sure how easy it's going to be cutting this. I need a mask. That insulation is nasty.
To notch this out, I need to use a saw for the length of the notch, but to get the end out I need to chip away with a chisel, which is quite a bit of mucking about.
Right, now that fits in there now. Beautiful.
Fitting this next sheet was like a walk in the park. Maybe not. In fact, I hadn't really checked the square of the sheet properly, so that bottom left corner there wouldn't really fit in, so needed more than gentle persuasion. In fact, I ended up damaging it a bit, but that's nothing that some filler won't fix. But eventually it did go in, and we brad nailed it in place. The next sheet had to also be fitted around that window, although wasn't in the corner, but then still had to get it to fit onto the first sheet with that plastic tongue, which is always a lot of fiddling about.
Right, I've cut this piece out of some offcut. Now the issue we have here is if you use the tongue there, you can't just push the sheet in and move it across. It could come in on this angle, but then we need to trim more off there and we end up with a gap in the wall. Now, it just so happened that when I did the framing for this, I got that one dead on right, so this sheet's stopped on the framing. So I've taken the tongue out and we'll see how this fits. Perfect. Almost. No. Fits perfectly. A nail. A nail. One of the brads is sticking out. And then we can just butt that up. There is a bit of a gap there, but we fill that in anyway. But so we don't need the tongue there. It works perfectly. Right, so we'll braid that in. The next wall sheeting we'll be putting on will be this corner here with the angle going up there.
This next sheet was a bit of a tight fit too, and required a little more than gentle persuasion. In fact, it was bordering on brute force to get it in. The reason being, I want to get the gaps as small as possible so there's less to fill in. This next sheet must fit between the new framing and that original corner post. So once again, I can't use the tongue between the sheets, but they do line up on the stud. And if it didn't line up, it's not so bad. It means that we have a little bit of variation there, like we do with the original tongue and groove boards, making the fake tongue and groove a little more believable.
Bit of a big gap there we're going to have to fill in. I didn't worry about cutting this too accurately because there was a groove right in there, and I'll just fill that in so the groove isn't seen. Although the groove continues on there, so damn.
We continue the same on the other side, except everything's mirrored of course, and this sheet wasn't quite as tight to fit in. Again, we're not worried about the tongue between the sheets because they fit on the stud nicely, and we don't want a big gap on the right hand side. We also needed to get the sheet to line up with that cross brace on the top right hand corner, because the original builders of this house didn't really care what lined up or not.
Well, where this wall blends into that corner there, we're not just going to leave it like that. The previous builder didn't. It looked terrible. So what we're going to do is take a bit of 45 by 70 and just run it up there, check it around that, run it up, blend it into that bracing at the top, run it across the ceiling there, run it across the floor. So it looks like, yeah, the original external frame that was on there.
We still have that last small piece of wall leading into the bathroom, which is much the same as the office wall. Except this time I didn't get the sheet as high, so ended up with a much larger gap at the top, making the fitting of the scotias a little difficult because there's nothing to nail them onto, so I had to put some packers in there.
The next job is lining the ceiling, starting in the office. I thought this would be straightforward. I know, stop laughing. My stupidity amazes me sometimes because it isn't straightforward. All the effort I put into that framing, and
I've had to pack everything out with handmade packers that have a different thickness at each end, so the sheeting will sit flat and so it will fit in the corner properly.
I thought I'd start with this end here because we've got this mitered corner, and I can use offcuts in here, which is a good use of material. The other thing is with the flat side at the top there, originally I was planning on making the sheeting coming across here, miter cut there, and then continue that way, which would have been nice if this wall wasn't here and it was going right through to the other room, which is just a big long ceiling. But on thinking about it,
It might be better just to put a sheet to run right across and butt up against here. So all the grooves will be coming up like that. Yeah, that might be a better idea, in which case this definitely needs to be the first one to be done, because that sets this edge. Food for thought. Oh, just grab a couple of bits of offcut. That's all the sawdust. Now that's so the edge of one piece there, and this is the edge of the other coming up against it like that. That one will be angled, of course. I think that will look okay. Yeah. On marking out and cutting a couple of pieces of offcut for this area, the most difficult part I found was getting the sheet the right way around. You'll notice a pencil line for the mitre going in the wrong direction, because when I drew this out, I'm looking at it from above, but when you're fitting it from below. So getting the sheet orientated the right way was quite difficult. In the end, I had to mark the corners A, B, C, D. That's the only way I could get that sheet orientated. It's just unbelievable. I then used an unprimed sheet that was left over from another part of the house, because this was the only one long enough. To get these longer sheets up, I had to use a panel lifter, because it's pretty hard to hold them and nail them at the same time. This was particularly necessary for the walk-in robe, because these sheets were 3.6 meters long. The tricky part here is getting the line between the flat sheet and the angled sheet nice and straight. If you watch the video on the framing of the ceiling, you'll see there was a lot of effort going to getting a nice straight line of timber for the sheeting to be nailed onto. If this joint isn't straight, it would look terrible. In fact, it would look like the original builders had a go at it. We wouldn't want that now, would we? We also like to have the wiring for the lighting inside the ceiling, so run this before putting the sheeting up. Unlike the previous builders that forgot about it and then just ran it all on the surface so it looked like a dog's breakfast. Okay, there are spots on the original walls that were just one layer of tongue and groove, so there was nowhere inside to put the wiring. In this case, you just use some neat trunking, which we'll be doing later on. It seems we've come to the end of this video now. In the next video, we'll be filling in all the gaps and painting the walls and ceilings. Oh yeah, sounds like a whole lot of fun.